Good morning. This is Bio 109 and we're at Feliz Paseos Park, a little bit west of West Campus. We're here because this is a good example of natural desert and we'll be able to see some native plants in a genuine ecological setting. We're going to be focusing on two plant families, the pea family and the cactus family. And we'll also learn a bit about how to identify plants in general, and we'll also learn a little bit about the ecology of several of these species, including some that are not in either of our two focus families. Because all of the other pea family members I'm going to show you are trees, I wanted to include this little guy to prove to you that not all pea family members are trees. By the way, if you eat beans, if you eat peas, you're eating members of the pea family, or at least their seeds. So this plant is blooming right now in August. We had some good rains. This is called desert senna, and it's got a very nice example of a compound leaf. This is a single leaf. We know because that's the petiole, which attaches to the stem of the plant, and each of these is a little leaflet. This one has pretty big leaves, even though it's one of the smallest members of the pea family around here. And the flower in this case is nice and big and dramatic. We'll look at some pea family flowers that don't look much like this. There's a lot of variation within this family. So let's move on to trees. I'm standing in front of three examples of members of the pea family, three different species. All of them happen to be trees, but there are a number of wildflowers and shrubs in our area that are also members of this family. One of them that's in your lecture is the desert senna, a little shrub that gets to be 2 feet tall at the most. But today we have some examples of trees in the pea family. And I'm going to start with Foothills Palo Verde, which is an extremely widespread tree. It occupies drier hillsides than does the blue and frequently the whitethorn acacia, which we'll also be talking about today. All of these trees have compound leaves, which many plants in the pea family have, but not all of them. For example, if you plant a bean seed, you'll get a plant with heart-shaped leaves, if you did that as a kid. Pea family plants are widespread in the desert because they team up with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And that means that they can better extract nitrogen from the soil than other plants. And that gives them a real edge in the desert because desert soils are typically nutrient, that is nitrogen poor. So that enables them to proliferate. So I mentioned these plants have compound leaves, and in all three cases of these trees, the leaves are very small. Smallest of all are the Foothills Palo Verdes. This one's up here. Some ways to identify this plant from a distance is the yellowish green cast of the tree itself. If you get up closer, it has reddish pods, which are about as long as your finger, and with constrictions, in other words, like little waistlines in between the seeds. So reddish-brown pods, tiny leaves, overall yellowish cast, commonly found in relatively dry desert areas. And then right next to me is a close relative, the blue Palo Verde. This one's a baby. A blue Palo Verde can, at maturity, have a crown, that's the width of the tree, of about 40 feet. And these plants are often restricted to washes. They're growing around the parking lot here at Feliz Paseos because the parking lot's irrigated. And so they get more water than they would if they were 50 feet that way. And that's why we don't see blue palo verdes elsewhere in the park, which is why we're talking in a parking lot. But the blue has slightly bigger leaves, still small by most people's standards, compound leaf. The pods are flat, a little bit shorter, so maybe the length of your little finger, kind of pale in color, and no waistline between seeds. And then our third example of the pea family here is the white thorn acacia. And ouch, this plant has white thorns most of the time. Occasionally some plants lack these sorts of thorns, but straight white thorns are a characteristic of this plant. Additionally, its leaves are doubly dissected or bipinnate, so it has tinier leaves even than the other two. Its pods are slender with a little bit of constriction between seeds and fairly long. Some of them get to be 4 or 5 inches long. This one is often found in washes as well. So the Foothills Palo Verde is the most dry upland adapted of all these three we're mentioning. This is another member of the pea family. This plant is an ironwood. This is a young one. These things can reach a height of 20 or 30 feet with a 40-foot width to the crown. Like the Palo Verdes and Mesquite, and this has compound leaves, slightly larger than the Palo Verdes. Another notable thing about it is it has grayish bark that's smooth on a lot of the stems. In spring, you can really distinguish these plants from other pea family trees because the flowers are white to a pale lavender. So the Palo Verdes, the white thorn acacia, mesquite, all have some variation of a yellow flower. But this one has kind of lavender white flowers. Can really be spectacular when it's in full bloom. It's called ironwood in part because the wood is exceptionally dense and heavy, and chunks of it will sink in water. It's a slow-growing tree. It retains its leaves for most of the year, but it takes a while for a plant in the open desert to get as big as this. But they're one of, the desert's most beautiful trees. One thing you see in the desert is that sometimes plants are spread out, like the ones immediately behind us. And then if you look further behind me, you'll see some plants are just clustered together. And so there are reasons why plants do either find themselves spaced either way. For a plant, they don't really get to make a decision. They grow where the seed falls, and if conditions are suitable, they'll survive. If they're not, the plant dies. So they don't make decisions about where they want to be. They just either are able to grow or are not. So we're going to look at some individual plants that sometimes cluster, and at some plants that are sometimes widely spaced, and see if we can address why. This is one of the plants we saw in the last shot. This is a triangle leaf Burrage, and it has triangle leaves that are serrated on the edges, so you can feel the edges are rough. Okay, and it's not a very imposing little plant. It never gets much more than, say, 2 feet in diameter, but this is an ecologically important plant. It's one of the first plants to colonize open desert areas that have been disturbed. It's very tolerant of high heat and dryness, and so often it's a pioneer plant that comes in ahead of others that will follow. And in the first shot, we saw some widely separated plants in the foreground, and sometimes desert plants are widely separated just because There's not that much water to go around, and if they're crowded, then no one survives. So that enforces, through mortality, a dispersed arrangement of plants. In other words, a widely scattered arrangement of plants. This is another plant that we saw in that wide shot. This one is called white Ratney, and it is a very interesting plant, for all that it doesn't look interesting. One reason is that the flowers, and there are a few here that are tiny. I think I have one in the lecture. But they're pretty little violet flowers that produce oil rather than nectar. And bees will come and collect oil, which is a nutrition source for them. So rather than reward, say, pollinators with nectar, this one rewards with oil. Okay? It has little spiny, sticky fruits. They don't really hurt. They're little spheres that catch onto the fur or feathers of other animals and get transported. See, it's stuck onto me. And when the fruits get dropped somewhere, that's where they'll germinate. The other interesting thing about this plant is it's what's called a hemiparasite. That means partial parasite. It can live on its own and do just fine. But one of the things it likes to do is live next to other plants, and its roots will connect with that of another plant and use the nutrients that that plant has drawn up. So it basically steals nutrients. One of the favorite plants that it associates with is creosote. And if you watch over decades, you'll see that as Ratney comes in, the creosotes start to disappear, and eventually they're gone. And then with, say, some hard times or real droughts, the Ratney disappears, the creosote comes back. But this is a sequence that could take 30 or 40 years to see that kind of turnover. Okay, but this is another way to survive. You know, if it's less expensive to get stuff from another plant, and so that's what this one does. This is creosote. This is the plant that white Ratney likes to associate with to steal nutrients from it. Creosote is an extremely widespread plant. It's not restricted to the Sonoran Desert. You find it in the Chihuahuan Desert, in the Mojave, and considerably north of here. It's tolerant of heat, it's tolerant of drought, and unlike a lot of desert plants, it's tolerant of cold. One thing you can kind of notice on the leaves here is there's a little bit, depending on how the sun hits them, of shine to them. And that's because this plant protects its leaves from drying out with a layer of resinous material. So it's waterproofed. Okay, so that reduces water loss on this plant. They can live a long time. There are records of some creosotes living for 11,000 years. And what happens is part of the plant dies and it spreads further out, and in some places you can find what looks like a ring of creosote bushes. It's all just one bush, and the survivors are at the edge. The fruits, and I don't see any on here, are little grayish, hairy things that split into about 3 seeds, 3 or 4. But this is another really common plant in the desert and a true survivor. This plant is probably familiar to most of you. This is an Ocotillo, and there are pictures in the lecture of this plant. It has numerous individual stems that radiate from a base. And you may remember from the lecture we talked about how even without leaves, this plant can photosynthesize through yellowish areas on the stems, which you can't see. We've had good rains recently, so this plant has leafed out. Ocotillos have simple leaves. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a simple leaf. And this plant is so responsive to rain that it will start, if it's had a good rain, it will start producing leaves within 48 hours of that rainstorm. So it's very, very opportunistic about photosynthesizing with its leaves, and it responds very quickly. These plants can send out new leaves, photosynthesize until it gets too dry to support these leaves, drop them, and then if another rain comes, put out a new set of leaves again. So they can basically turn on massive photosynthesis and turn it off depending on weather conditions. Also, since rains of a few weeks ago, this plant has sent up about that much of new growth. Okay, and these thorns here are these are actually spines, because a spine is a modified leaf, a thorn is a modified branch, and a prickle is modified plant skin. So roses don't have thorns, they have prickles because it's skin, which we're not worrying about. This one's not in bloom, but as you probably know, this is a favorite hummingbird flower. Red flowers at the ends of these stems in huge clusters up to, say, 10, 11 inches. They're up high, so the birds can reach them without interference. And they tend to bloom right when many North American hummingbirds are migrating through the desert. So it works great for the hummingbirds and it works great for these plants. This plant is a jojoba. They can get to be 6, maybe 8 feet in diameter, and they're another unusual desert plant. One reason they're unusual is that these plants they're either male or female. Most plants are both, but this one comes either in a male or female configuration. This one's a female because it's got a few fruits remaining on it. Only female parts of flowers produce fruits. It's another tough plant. I haven't talked about this much before, but many plants in the desert are gray-green or blue-green or a muted green, and that's because they have some kind of surface on the leaf itself to reduce water loss. So they may have hairs or some kind of thick outer skin or something like that, and jojobas do too, and that's how they can get away with having relatively large leaves on the plant. These are thick, leathery leaves. The other thing about this plant is that it's pollinated not by animals but by wind. Okay, so it depends on wind carrying pollen from a male plant to reach a female plant. And there have actually been some studies that indicate that the flowers, which we're not seeing right now, are kind of adapted to help air sort of corkscrew in towards the flower, carrying pollen. This plant is big enough to also act as a nurse plant. We talk about nurse plants in one of the lectures as how saguaros start out, but other kinds of plants of all types often start out under another plant, and that's because there's shade. So for a very young plant, the possibility of overheating and dying from that is significant. Often they can associate with fungi that are already developed around a plant that help bring water or nutrients to the plant. So there are various advantages like that. In this case, the plant has acted as a nurse plant to a very special kind of cactus called the Queen of the Night. Okay, so this slender stem you see here is a Queen of the Night cactus. And it produces, so most of the year it's just an inconspicuous thing you can barely see in the bush. But in late spring, early summer, it will produce blooms that are, say, 4 inches in diameter. White, moth-pollinated flowers. And then after that, if it's been successfully pollinated, it produces red fruits that look kind of like the old-fashioned Christmas lights. So if you're ever walking in the desert and you see what looks like 2 or 3 Christmas lights on a bush in the middle of nowhere, it's probably the fruits of this cactus. So if you approach, you can pick out the stem again. Okay. But this is the reason why some plants cluster. Sometimes it's advantageous to cluster. Sometimes it's advantageous to spread out like that Burrage we saw earlier. Here we have 3 members of the cactus family, and of course we're all familiar with cactus in general. We see them everywhere, but they have some particular adaptations that make them superior occupants of the desert, able to survive some very harsh conditions. One of them is that they've given up on leaves, so they don't photosynthesize through their leaves. Instead, they've developed these thick, fleshy stems. So in the case of this little fishhook cactus here, a little mammillaria, it's got, a thick body. Same with the barrel cactus over here. And of course, the prickly pear with its flat pads are also considered fleshy. This enables them to store water in their tissue. It's not like there's a quantity of water sloshing around inside them. It's kind of very moist tissue. So they can absorb a lot of water after a rainfall and then survive quite comfortably for a long period of time until it rains again. Okay, and we have jointed cactus with the prickly pear that I mentioned before. And these 2 are not jointed ones. So I'm going to focus for a moment on the barrel cactus, which we haven't talked about yet. And these guys sometimes get as high as 6 feet tall. They never grow branches. And to distinguish them from a saguaro, look at the spines. So if you look at the spines here, they have a big central spine that's typically a bit hooked. And sometimes there's little ridges across the top of the flattened spine that you can feel. And then there are clusters of straight spines at the base of each of these big hooked spines. This one has a flower that's starting to open, but it has been pollinated already by typically native bees. Honeybees don't really like barrel cacti much because they produce more pollen than nectar. And honeybees like nectar a lot. But native bees gravitate towards that abundant pollen, and so they're the primary pollinators. But down here, right at the tip of my finger, you can see some developing fruits. The dried petals of the flower are still persistent on here. These will get a little bit bigger and turn yellow, and animals like deer and other mammals, small mammals, will come and feed on them. Some of the little ground squirrels have a body about that long will pick up one of these that's about a third its length and carry it away and eat it. And here, the little mammillaria here is also called a fishhook because it has curved spines as well. They're much more delicate. And this is a cluster. They often grow in clusters, and they're often pretty good sized. One thing you can see with both of these 2 cacti is you don't see much green on the little mammillaria in particular, but you can also see on this barrel cactus that the spines kind of, in addition to sticking out to deter herbivores, they also cover some of the surface of the green tissue. This is how a cactus, both these cactus in particular, create their own shade. The spines, even though they're skinny, will shade the body of the cactus, help it avoid excessive overheating, and enable it to have better chances of survival. So in a minute, we're going to look at a couple of photos of this particular cactus in bloom. Unlike the barrel cactus, which blooms reliably in the fall, this little mammillaria blooms in response to rain. And we did have rain a little while ago, and we found a couple of plants that are in bloom right now. Hey, this is an example of a really familiar cactus, a prickly pear. And like a cholla, it's a jointed cactus. But in this case, each of the joints is a flat, wide pad as opposed to a cylindrical one, like on buckhorn and chainfruit cholla. This is a very common plant. There are several species in our area, but all of them have this broad, flat kind of pad. And often on some of these plants, you don't always see it, but often the pads orient so they're kind of at edge on to the harshest sunlight of all. And that's one way they can have these broad pads and get away with it on a day like today when it's expected to hit 108. This prickly pear plant happens to be in fruit, and that's what these reddish structures are. Sometimes they're referred to as tunas, because you can eat many of these fruits, but they ripen in the fall, like now, and they're a favorite food of many kinds of animals, including javelina and deer and pack rats and round-tailed ground squirrels and so on. So they're a very important source of nutrition for many animals in the desert. It's a little bit later in the morning, and the barrel cacti flowers are opening up. They seem to close at night. But one of the things I wanted to comment on was that when you look at these flowers, if you look at a number of barrel cacti in a given location, sometimes you'll see that this one's kind of a medium orange, some are more reddish, and some shade more towards yellow. And this is an example of naturally occurring variation. And, for most of us walking by, we might say, well, that's really cool. But this is exactly what Charles Darwin focused on, was the idea of naturally occurring variants that essentially would be in competition with each other to see who would leave the most offspring. And that phenomenon over time drives speciation in both plants, animals, and other organisms. One other interesting aspect about barrel cacti is that they're in a mutualistic arrangement with a small, very small species, actually more than one small species of desert ant. Barrel cacti don't produce much in the way of nectar. I may have mentioned that before. But along the ribs, so that's the prominent parts of the body of the cactus, at the base of spine clusters are some tiny little button-like structures. They're about the size of a pinhead, and they're called extrafloral nectaries. These little nectaries secrete a tiny amount of nectar that these tiny ants love. Everybody likes sugar, and ants are no exception. But the ants regard it as a resource, and so they will attack any insect that lands on this barrel cactus. So in exchange for nectar, the ants provide the barrel cactus with some added protection. And because this benefits both parties, the plant and the insect, we would call this a mutualism. This is a hedgehog cactus. Like the fishhook mammillaria, it often grows in clusters like this one. It doesn't get too much bigger than this. You can distinguish it from the fishhook cactus because it's got longer spines that are straight. They never hook. In spring, we see some leftover flowers here with maybe some fruit below it that's very spiny. But in spring, these plants produce spectacular bright pink magenta flowers or a lovely pale pink flower. There are actually two species in our area that otherwise look very similar. This is a member of the cactus family, as you might easily guess. Plenty of spines. This is a chain fruit cholla, and it often looks relatively tree-like with a dark trunk and this sort of array of branches. It's called chain fruit cholla because the fruits, which in this case are pale green, like the rest of the plant, hang in chains. So if you see a cactus that looks like it's got something kind of like a bunch of grapes hanging below the branches, you're probably looking at a chain fruit cholla. This is also what's called a jointed cactus, and that includes things like prickly pear, Christmas cactus, this one, teddy bear cholla, and so forth. And that's because the branches are divided into joints. When these break off, as they often do, the joints are capable of sprouting on the ground and growing into a new independent plant. Like other plants, many of the other plants, this one's not blooming right now, but it has these really tiny, bright pink flowers that are quite attractive. This is a Christmas cactus. It's one of the smaller jointed cacti in our area. Again, it branches in segments, and these segments will drop off really easily. And if conditions are good, they'll start a new plant. This one's tolerant of shade. You often find it in washes, but it can also grow in dry locations like this. This one's nice and fat because we've had rains. These are fruits, these red structures here, and many birds and rodents will eat these fruits, and that's how seeds get dispersed. Plants don't make good-tasting fruits because they like us. They make good-tasting fruits or edible fruits, because as animals come to eat them, they'll either disperse them by carrying them on their fur, or they'll eat the fruit entirely, seeds and all, and poop the seeds out somewhere new. This is how a plant that can't move gets seeds moved to other new locations. Okay, this is an example of a buckhorn cholla. This is another kind of jointed cactus. So if you look at this, especially kind of above my head, you can see that the branches, and these are true branches, are in segments. Not all cacti have as many joints, so to speak, as a buckhorn does. So for example, a saguaro has a straight stem and maybe a couple of arms. But this branching pattern is common to quite a few species here, including chollas of all kinds and prickly pears of all kinds. So this one has a few little fruits here, and you can contrast that with the chain fruit cholla, which has those clusters of descending fruits, like a bunch of grapes, kind of, sorta. But this one typically just has fruits at the very ends of some of its branches. Up here, you can see something kind of cool. This is new growth of this year, probably since the rain started. So here's one that's the size of my finger. There's one that's the size of my foot, the length of my foot. But if you look closely at this, you can see that some of the spines look like little green cones. And that's how spines on cacti start out. With time, the soft tissue kind of dies away, and the central rib is remaining as the spine that sticks into you. But spines are modified leaves, and so they kind of start out as just barely looking something like a leaf. Kind of, sort of. Right behind me is perhaps the most iconic plant of the Sonoran Desert, and that's a saguaro cactus. This is the biggest cactus in our area. It's considered a columnar cactus, and it too is like some other plants we're going to talk about or have talked about. It's a plant that has essentially moved up from the south. If you go further south into Mexico, further south into Peru and Argentina, you'll see many kinds of giant cactus. The saguaro cactus is perhaps one of the best adapted to tolerating cold conditions, although it has limits. The upper limit, the northern limit of saguaro cacti in the United States, which is about a third of the way up Arizona, is the number of continuous days where the temperature doesn't get above freezing. Saguaros subjected to that can't survive, so an environmental constraint determines the northern limit of their distribution. As the climate warms, we do expect that this population may advance a little bit further north than we presently see. Saguaro are cactus that are survivors. Like other cactus, they store water in their tissues. When drought comes, they actually get skinnier as they metabolize some of that water that they've stored. After big rain, they can get big and fat. So they're good survivors. They're also good competitors. They produce a fine network of roots just a few inches below the surface. So they're really adept at capturing the slightest of rainfalls. And because of this, and because of their ability to persist, they sometimes outcompete, say, a nurse plant that's given them shelter. That's something we'll be talking about in the next lecture. As you probably know, they produce large, waxy white flowers, 3 or 4 inches across, and they get a lot of visitors. Bats are one of the best known lesser long-nosed bats, but many people have found that the best pollinator in our area is actually white-winged doves. Hummingbirds will also visit these flowers, as will honeybees and other insects. So it's an extremely important plant in many senses of the word. Okay, we're at a little pool, also at Feliz Paseos Park. This is largely artificial. There's a little feed pipe to the pool, but it does get some runoff from the hill above. And whenever you put water in the desert, you get life. So we have some plants growing around here that are a little bit lusher than they would be in open desert, and sometimes we get species here that we won't find in open desert, and maybe we'll get a chance to look at some of those. But water also attracts a lot of animals. We see dragonflies flitting across the surface of the pond. They're interested in catching little insects that are also attracted, and they also breed in aquatic areas. So young dragonflies develop in water. They can't develop on land. So something like this is extremely important for reproduction for these insects. There are also some little toad polywogs in here, and it's hard to identify polywogs, and it's hard to identify recently emerged toads, often because they're tiny. And we're going to show you some close-ups of what I think is a spadefoot toad that's just emerged. It's just changed from the polywog state into a tiny little frog state. And now it's on its own on land, and it's got to figure out how to survive on land, having just emerged from an aquatic lifestyle. Okay, one of the occupants of this little pool are tadpoles and or polywogs and the little toads that emerge. So I caught one of them. This is probably a newly emerged spadefoot toad. Spadefoots with some species can go from egg to toadlet in as few as 8 days. makes a lot of sense in the desert, where they often breed in temporary pools where if you don't metamorphosize, in other words, if you don't change into a toadlet quickly, the water's going to dry up and you're going to be a pollywog in big trouble. So there's a lot of evolutionary pressure on these guys to metamorphosize quickly and get out on land, feed a little bit, and then find a place to shelter for the rest of the year. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to release this little guy because they're not pets. They're not something you want to keep, and I want him back where he is. I'm going to kind of pour him out on the rock because he really doesn't want to swim that much now. He wants to be hopping. So here we go. Now I've just dipped up a few polywogs from that same pond or pool. And these guys are a little bit behind the little toadlet, or they will turn into toadlets pretty soon. The life of many desert toads and other amphibians can get bizarre. Typically, a polywog starts life as a vegetarian, feeding on algae and stuff like that. But in desert pools in particular, because they dry down so fast, there's a huge amount of evolutionary pressure to get out of the pool quickly. And sometimes you can't grow up fast enough just eating algae. So sometimes a little metabolic switch is flipped in these guys and they turn cannibal. They'll develop bigger jaws and they'll start attacking other polywogs. The higher protein diet enables them to metamorphosize quickly. There are costs to this because if you're a cannibal, that's a good way to pick up diseases from the members of your own species that you ate. So unless a pond is really drying down and they seem able to sense this, they will stay as vegetarians. Amazingly enough, in at least one spadefoot species, some individuals have been known to switch back if conditions in the pond improve. So if you have a rainstorm that brings in more water, they might switch back. And that would enable them to still complete development, but avoid the risks of being a cannibal. The other cool thing about these guys is that toads and frogs typically lay their eggs in large quantities, strings of eggs or clusters of eggs. And it's been shown that in some frog and toad species, the little polywogs recognize who's a member of my family or my batch of eggs and who isn't. And they tend to prefer to cluster with members of their sisters and brothers, so to speak. And there's some indication that if they turn cannibal, they tend to avoid eating their brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in a little cluster of polywogs that you see in a pond. In a minute, I'm going to release these guys back into the pool we got them from, because as I said before, these are not pets. All right, so we're going to let these little guys go. I'm putting them back in the water next to the other polywogs clustered at the shore, because I think that's where they want to be. Let's get them all in there. Get everybody out. Okay, so we're good to go. Okay, this plant is called, actually it has several common names: crucifixion thorn, all thorn, crown of thorns. And this is one reason why scientists like Latin names, is they're official. They don't change from locale to locale. The spelling doesn't change, and so on. But aside from that, this plant is also interesting because it is a pioneer from the tropics. In the tropics, this plant can get several meters high and be a tree. A few of the ones I've seen in Arizona are kind of shrubby, and this patch for years has not gotten much higher than 3 feet tall. So that all suggests that this might be the upper edge of its tolerances for desert conditions. But this is a visitor from the tropics. Now, we've got a couple of flowers here, so it's produced just a couple of blooms right now, probably either the wrong time of year or the wrong amount of rain. Once it finishes flowering, it produces these little globular fruits that turn dark black and are favored by birds. This concludes our first field trip to Feliz Paseos Park. I hope you learned how to identify a few of the native species that populate this exceptionally rich desert. I hope you got a sense of some of the interactions we can see between plants and between plants and animals. And I hope you got a sense of some of the remarkable adaptations that desert plants have developed in response to an extremely unforgiving environment. And most of all, I'd like you to appreciate that this is a dynamic, living ecosystem that changes right under our noses in all kinds of unexpected ways.